Explosive emails have just leaked, proving what we knew all along. Panels honoring Black World War II soldiers were removed on purpose to erase black soldiers and to avoid angering Trump. The subject line literally says, "Foreign DEI." The secretary wrote explicitly that he wanted to avoid raising any ire of the administration. This wasn't routine rotation like they claimed. This was deliberate political censorship, and we now have the documents that prove it. Quick context if you're just joining us. In March 2025, the American Battle Monuments Commission quietly removed 2 panels from the visitor center at Margraten Cemetery in the Netherlands. These panels honored black soldiers who liberated Europe and buried the dead at what became one of America's largest military cemeteries overseas. When the removal was discovered in November, officials claimed it was just normal exhibit rotation. That was a lie. For the full story on what these panels showed and why they mattered, click the video on screen at the end. But right now, we need to talk about what these newly released emails reveal. The emails are damning. March 19th, 2025. The same day President Trump signs an executive order targeting diversity programs in foreign-facing agencies. Charles Dujoux, Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission, sends an urgent message to his staff. Subject line, "Foreign DEI." He wants to know if any displays at overseas military cemeteries might get us in trouble with the new administration. A senior ABMC staffer responds that he's already scrubbed the agency's website of potentially problematic material. The Margraten panel about segregation and racism faced by black soldiers is definitely a problem. Dujoux deputy, Robert D'Alessandro, goes even further. "I agree on the Netherlands. That panel should go. Frankly, it never should have been there in the first place." Dujoux orders the removal explicitly to avoid raising any ire of the administration. In a follow-up message, he suggests keeping the panels in storage at least until a new admin in 2029. This was a calculated political decision made out of fear that telling the truth about American history might anger the president. The panels told essential stories that had been ignored for 80 years. One honored George H. Pruitt, a 23-year-old black soldier from New Jersey who served in the 43rd Signal Construction Battalion. On June 10th, 1945, more than a month after Germany surrendered, Pruitt was in Bremen, Germany, when a fellow soldier fell into a river. Without hesitation, Pruitt dove in to save him. He drowned in the attempt. His body was later brought to Margraten, where it rests among the 174 black Americans buried at the cemetery. For decades, visitors walked past his grave, never knowing his story or his sacrifice. The other panel was titled "African American Service Members in World War II, Fighting on Two Fronts." It explained the brutal reality of segregation in the U.S. military. How more than 1 million black Americans enlisted to fight fascism abroad while facing racist policies at home, how they were limited primarily to labor and support roles, despite their willingness to serve in combat. It told the story of the WWII campaign, victory over fascism abroad and racism at home, a movement that would help spark the civil rights era. The panel featured a quote from First Lieutenant Jefferson Wiggins. In the fall of 1944, Wiggins was a 19-year-old first sergeant assigned to the 960th Quartermaster Service Company. His unit, composed primarily of black soldiers, arrived in Margraten with one of the grimmest tasks of the war: dig the graves and bury the American dead. For months they performed this heartbreaking work, constructing what would become one of the largest American military cemeteries in Europe. Wiggins described the trauma decades later. There was a permanent arrival of bodies, the whole day long. Sundays included, 7 days a week. I find it difficult even now to read in the paper that soldiers gave their lives. All those boys in Margraten, their lives were taken away. Then came the bitter irony that haunted him. And here we all were, this group of black Americans having to deal with these bodies of white Americans. The stark reality was we had to bury those soldiers, although we couldn't sit in the same room with them when they were alive. These black soldiers handled the dead with dignity and respect that those same soldiers might not have shown them in life. And 80 years later, American officials decided their story shouldn't be told. Janice Wiggins, Jefferson's widow, had been one of the driving forces behind getting these panels installed. When the cemetery's new visitor center opened in 2023, she attended the ceremony with pride and excitement. But as she walked through the exhibits, she realized something was missing. There was no mention of the African American soldiers who had built the cemetery, who had buried the dead, who had performed this traumatic work for months. She was stunned. The omission felt deliberate, though she believed it was probably just oversight. She began advocating for recognition, reaching out to the American Battle Monuments Commission, writing letters, making phone calls. She found an ally in Shefali Razdan Dugal, the Biden-appointed ambassador to the Netherlands, who understood the importance of telling this story. Together, they pushed for panels that would acknowledge the contributions and struggles of Black service members. The panels were installed in September 2024. They were designed to be permanent fixtures, not temporary rotating displays. Janice was clear about that from the beginning. These weren't meant to come and go. They were meant to be a lasting acknowledgement of a story too long ignored. 6 months later, they were gone. Janice learned about the removal not through any official communication, but through news reports from Dutch media. No one from the ABMC called to explain. No one sought her input or asked how she felt about removing her late husband's story from public view. The panels were simply taken down and put into storage as if they'd never mattered at all. When she finally spoke to reporters, her words were measured but devastating. She said her late husband, who died in 2013 after reaching the rank of first lieutenant, would be disappointed, but not surprised, by the Trump administration's actions. He wasn't naive about the world he lived in, she explained. Jefferson had lived through decades of discrimination, had seen promises of equality broken again and again. This would have confirmed what he already knew, but Janice wanted to be clear about what this removal really meant. It's not a matter of a panel that has my husband's name on it. That's not the issue. The issue is that these are a group of men who contributed to their country, who, like almost every soldier during World War II, went through great trauma and bore that for the rest of their lives. Jefferson used to tell her that people should know about what happened, about what he and the other Black soldiers endured, about the discrimination they faced while serving their country, about the bodies they buried and the trauma they carried. He believed that remembering was painful, but necessary. The ABMC decided people shouldn't know after all. When Dutch media first reported the removal in November 2024, ABMC officials claimed the panels were part of routine rotation in limited visitor center space. They said Pruitt's panel was currently off display, though not out of rotation. They never mentioned the foreign DEI emails or Trump's executive order. After the FOIA emails became public, the ABMC issued a new statement. The Netherlands American Cemetery, with its singular mission to honor those who fell in combat and are buried and memorialized there, is not the appropriate venue for interpreting or debating broader societal issues, however real and significant those issues were and are. They're calling racism faced by American soldiers a broader societal issue that shouldn't be discussed at a military cemetery. The segregation of the U.S. Army is somehow separate from the story of soldiers who served in that segregated army, and these panels only became inappropriate when a new administration took power. Robert D'Alessandro, who became acting secretary after Duju was removed, claimed his opposition had nothing to do with race. His problem was that Jefferson Wiggins wasn't buried at Margraten. We have 10,000 service members either buried or memorialized at that cemetery, of which Wiggins is not one, he said. But Wiggins was directly connected to the cemetery through building it and burying the dead. The ABMC approved his inclusion with full knowledge he survived the war, and D'Alessandro's March email contradicts his later explanation. He didn't say, "We shouldn't feature someone not buried here." He said, "That panel should go. Frankly, it never should have been there in the first place. That's about content, not mission scope, and it doesn't explain removing the segregation panel at all." Charles Duju himself admitted to CNN that the removal was done via an internal agency review at the prompting of the Trump administration, not space constraints, not mission scope, because the administration wanted it gone, and his compliance didn't save his job. Weeks after the panels came down, he was out. A former colleague described it bluntly. "We had a secretary who was appointed by Biden, and fearful that he was going to lose his job, so he overcomplied whenever he could, so he didn't draw attention. And that's just a fact. And that was a problem." Ju saw Trump's executive order about DEI programs and panicked, even though it didn't technically apply to the ABMC. He preemptively censored his own agency's exhibits, ordering erasure not because anyone demanded it, but because he feared someone might. The reaction in the Netherlands has been fierce and sustained. For 80 years, Dutch citizens have maintained one of the most extraordinary traditions in military commemoration. They adopt the graves of fallen Americans at Margraten, learning the names of individual soldiers, researching their lives, decorating their graves, visiting multiple times a year. Some Dutch families have portraits of American soldiers in their homes, soldiers they never met, but whose memory they've kept alive across generations. More than 1,000 people are currently on the waiting list to become grave adopters. This isn't a declining tradition of the war generation. Young Dutch people who have no personal memory of World War II or the liberation want to participate. They see it as a sacred duty to honor those who died freeing their country from Nazi occupation. The Dutch view the cemetery as part of their own history, not just American history. The soldiers buried there died on Dutch soil, liberating the Netherlands. The black soldiers who built the cemetery and buried the dead are inseparable from that liberation story. To erase their contribution isn't just an American political decision, it's erasing Dutch history too. Mayor Alain Kreinen of IJsden Margraten wrote directly to the ABMC with a carefully worded but firm request. We would greatly appreciate it if the story of the Black Liberators, like the 172 Black Liberators buried in Margraten, could be given permanent attention in the visitor center, and therefore reconsider the removal of the displays. His letter emphasized the strong relationship between the municipality and the ABMC, expressing confidence that the Commission would seriously consider this request from the community that has protected and honored American graves for 8 decades. Months later, the panels remain in storage. Emile Roma, the King's Commissioner for Limburg Province, met directly with U.S. Ambassador Joseph Popolo Jr. to make the case for restoration. A spokesperson for Roma's office made the stakes crystal clear. Those black liberators played a crucial role in the liberation of Limburg. There was deep segregation in the army. They fought for a freedom they themselves didn't have. The spokesperson then asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Was the removal of these panels an unfortunate coincidence, or does it reflect a deliberate choice to sideline these stories? Thanks to the FOIA emails, we now know the answer. It was absolutely deliberate. 11 political parties in the Limburg Provincial Council, representing a rare cross-party consensus, issued a joint statement demanding action. Only 4 parties declined to sign on. The statement demanded that the panels be reinstalled immediately. If the ABMC refuses, the Dutch officials called for creation of a new, permanent memorial dedicated to Black American liberators, though they emphasized that the proper place for such recognition is inside the cemetery itself. Dutch historians have been particularly vocal about the removal. Kees Ribbens, a senior researcher at the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, and a history professor at Erasmus University Rotterdam, was among the first to draw attention to the missing panels in Dutch media. He told reporters something revealing. I grew up in South Limburg, but it was not until much later that I learned that the cemetery had been constructed by Black Americans under difficult conditions, beginning in late 1944. That admission captures exactly what the panels were meant to address. Even Dutch people who grew up near the cemetery, who visited it regularly, who understood its significance, didn't know this crucial part of its history. The panels filled that gap. They told a story that needed telling, and now they're gone. The Black Liberators Foundation, a Dutch organization dedicated to researching and commemorating Black American soldiers who fought in the Netherlands, has been at the forefront of the restoration effort. They've spent years documenting the contributions of Black service members, tracking down family members, and ensuring these stories are preserved. When a Dutch television program called Even Tot Here briefly reinstalled the panels on November 23rd as part of a news story about the controversy, police and military police immediately appeared to supervise their removal. The program had intended to take the panels down after filming anyway, but the swift official response demonstrated just how politically sensitive this issue had become. The panels were then handed over to the Black Liberators Foundation, where they remain in safekeeping, waiting for a resolution that seems increasingly unlikely. In the United States, 34 Democratic members of Congress sent a letter calling the removal part of a months-long campaign against diversity initiatives. They wrote, "More than 1 million African Americans fought in World War II, most of them in segregated units. They were willing to die for a country that did not provide them with the same opportunities, services, or recognition." The letter characterized the removal as erasing Not only black history, but also our collective American history. This isn't isolated. In March 2025, Arlington National Cemetery removed references to black and female service members from its website. The Pentagon removed a web page celebrating Medal of Honor recipient Major General Charles Calvin Rogers, a black Vietnam veteran, then restored it only after outcry. These aren't coincidences. The FOIA emails prove its coordinated policy. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and what we choose to tell. The ABMC, under pressure they anticipated from the Trump administration, chose to stop telling part of the story. They chose to make black soldiers' contributions and struggles invisible. Consider what's actually been lost. Visitors to Margraten, especially American visitors who may know nothing about the cemetery's construction, no longer learn that black soldiers built it. They walk through rows of white crosses and stars of David on immaculately maintained grounds without knowing that the men who dug these graves, who lowered these bodies into the earth, who performed this sacred and traumatic work, were primarily black Americans serving in a segregated military. They don't learn about the WWII campaign, about black Americans fighting fascism abroad while confronting racism at home. They don't learn that the 174 black soldiers buried at Margraten served a country that didn't provide them equal opportunities, services, or recognition. They don't learn that these men were willing to die for a nation that might not have allowed them to eat at the same lunch counter as the white soldiers buried beside them. Jefferson Wiggins wanted people to know. He told his widow repeatedly that the story needed to be told, that people should understand what he and his fellow soldiers went through. The ABMC gave him a voice for 6 months. Then they silenced him because his truth was politically inconvenient. George H. Pruitt died trying to save a fellow soldier. He's buried at Margraten, one of the 174 black Americans laid to rest there. For a brief time, visitors to the cemetery could learn his name, his story, his sacrifice. Now they can't. His grave remains, but his story has been erased from the official narrative. The 960th Quartermaster Service Company performed one of the war's most traumatic tasks for months on end. They deserve recognition for that service. They had it. It was taken away not because the facts changed, but because the politics did. DW's suggestion to keep panels in storage until a new admin in 2029 assumed this was temporary. But that's 4 years of thousands of visitors never learning about the black soldiers who built the cemetery. And what precedent does this set? If truthful historical panels can be removed because they might anger the administration, what other uncomfortable truths will be erased? The ABMC's statement about the cemetery not being the appropriate venue for interpreting or debating broader societal issues frames racism and segregation as debate topics rather than historical facts. There's no debate about whether the US military was segregated during World War II. It was. These are facts, not interpretations. The only debate is whether those facts should be shared with the public. The families of soldiers buried at Margraten deserve better. Jefferson Wiggins deserves better. George H. Pruitt deserves better. The 174 black Americans buried there deserve better. The truth deserves better than being hidden in storage to avoid a president's anger. The panels remain removed. Dutch citizens continue pushing for restoration. American families continue demanding recognition. But right now, visitors to Margraten don't see those panels or learn those stories. The erasure is ongoing. Charles WWII wrote that he wanted to avoid raising any ire of the administration. The panels came down quietly with no public announcement, no explanation to families, no consultation with Dutch officials. But the anger came anyway. From the Netherlands, from military families, from historians, from anyone who believes honoring the dead means telling the full truth about their service and sacrifice. The ABMC's fear of political consequences led them to erase history. The FOIA emails prove it was deliberate, coordinated, and motivated by politics rather than principle. Jefferson Wiggins wanted people to know. For 6 months, they could. Now they can't. Not because his story became less important or less true, but because telling that truth became politically dangerous. American officials chose politics over history, fear over honor, erasure over acknowledgement. And that's why this matters far beyond 2 panels at a cemetery in the Netherlands. It's about who gets remembered and who gets erased. It's about whether we tell the full story of American service and sacrifice, or only the parts that don't make anyone uncomfortable. It's about whether truth matters more than politics. Right now, at Margraten, politics won.